I'm Greg Guma, and this is the People's Republic. Confrontation and war, or understanding and reconciliation. Sometimes it's a tough call, and leaders can make all the difference. It isn't easy, and the country has certainly had all kinds. So has Pacifica Radio, the original listener-sponsored network. It has also often been at war with itself, but it didn't start out that way. This week, how Pacifica Radio began. WBAI's legendary freeform past. Dustin Hoffman, yes, the real one, reading part of War and Peace. Sounds of the 1979 March for Gay Rights. Comedy from Mushroom Cloud Theater. And early shots in progressive media's Civil War. It's Planet Pacifica. Growing Pains. Pacifica Radio's founder, Lew Hill, was the son of an Oklahoma millionaire. Not that there is anything wrong with it. He also studied Kierkegaard and Gandhi at Stanford, and then became a conscientious objector. But he came up with the idea for a pacifist-oriented radio station elsewhere, at first while working at a remote, church-funded civilian public service camp in Colville, California. It was one of many camps set up for those who refused to fight in World War II. It was a time of emerging anti-communist fever, known soon as the McCarthy era, after the powerful and unscrupulous Wisconsin senator. Hollywood screenwriters were jailed for refusing to discuss their political activities. During KPFA's first months on the air, union leader Harry Bridges was imprisoned for concealing his ties with the Communist Party. A dozen California communist leaders were convicted for violating the Smith Act, which made it a crime to advocate the overthrow of the government. KPFA, the first Pacifica station, went on the air in April 1949. Initially, it reached relatively few people in the San Francisco Bay Area on the new FM dial. Radio broadcasting had been around for about 30 years. Serious radio news reporting was only a decade old, beginning with the coverage of the 1938 Munich Agreement and increasing tensions in Europe before the war. Radio broadcasting, though, had become a hugely profitable enterprise, especially for the two large networks, CBS and NBC, and independent stations in larger markets. They, in turn, were the guardians of a reactionary, middle-brow national culture and audience. There were only a few main commandments in this field: keep it clean, keep it friendly, and avoid controversy whenever possible. Pacifica Radio and the Pacifica Foundation would be different. Yet for Hill and early volunteers and hopes, the purposes of the new station was dialogue, not revolution, education, not profit, but certainly not communism. Even pacifism, which had helped inspire its birth, played an only marginal role as KPFA struggled to find a place in Berkeley's then relatively insular university community. Hill's interest in launching a station was further fueled by a job announcing at WINX in Washington, D.C. toward the end of World War II. At first, it brought him together with Joy Cole, a kindred spirit who shared his anti-war sentiments and general desire to create a better world. They married in 1944. But ultimately, Hill couldn't accept the restrictions and the distortions that had become commonplace in commercial radio. His qualms ultimately became intolerable in May 1945 when he was handed a story about the people at Tule Lake. He knew what that euphemism really meant. Tule Lake was the site of one of the most infamous internment camps for Japanese Americans during the war, a so-called segregation camp in Northern California that warehoused more than 18,000 people for several years. It had just closed. Hill, who knew about it from work nearby as a war resister, refused to read a misleading report and turned in his resignation. A year later, After moving to San Francisco, he submitted his proposal for a radio station to the Federal Communications Commission and wrote a fundraising prospectus. The idea was that people who were committed to nonviolence could reach beyond the choir, beyond ivory tower intellectuals and war resistors, and reach the average man by bonding with the community through a station. In what became the single most important document in Pacifica history, he outlined the purposes of a new educational foundation in a series of bold, idealistic statements that remained central to its self-image for 6 decades. Hill's vision was that the Foundation's main project, KPFA, would engage, quote, in any activity that shall contribute to a lasting understanding between nations and between individuals of all nations, races, creeds, and colors. He wrote that it would, quote, gather and disseminate information on the causes of conflict between any and all such groups and promote the study of political and economic problems and the causes of religious, philosophical, and racial antagonisms. And how? Through dialogue, through diverse groups and people openly communicating with each other on the air. The objective wasn't to discover and convey indisputable truths. It was to nurture an open exchange of ideas that could help people come to know each other as human beings. Dialogue that demonstrated the possibility of peace in practice. By the time I became CEO, more than a half-century later, however, Pacifica had evolved into something else, a national progressive radio network, a source of alternative news and viewpoints, a platform for many underserved constituencies, but also for identity politics, and too often for politically correct wisdom, as well as angry internal bickering over process, ideology, airtime, and assigning blame, all of which prevented the network from making a bigger impact on social discourse, or, as Hill more modestly hoped, creating constructive connections between people. There was ambiguity from the start. The goals, when Hill put them in writing, tended to shift with his audience. In pitches to the Ford Foundation and in the 1952 book, for instance, he dropped words like pacifism and peace and replaced them with personal freedom and imagination. Rather than bonding with the community by discussing the local and familiar, the station offered, quote, serious cultural broadcasting to secure the support of 2% of the area's total FM audience. Just 2%. This formula became central to his theory of sustainable listener sponsorship through voluntary subscriptions. For the first 5 years, however, not enough listeners sent in money, and the station depended on wealthy benefactors and major foundations. Matthew Lazar noted years later in Pacifica Radio, The Rise of an Alternative Network, early announcers would often boast that as an advertisement-free station, KPFA didn't need to appease commercial influences. True. On the other hand, Lazar added, this freedom did not protect Lew Hill and his band of utopians from the strict ideological requirements of the liberal corporate state. But there were also moments like the War and Peace readings in 1970.
My name is Dustin Hoffman, and I'm reading Book 1, Part 1 of Mel Brooks's translation of War and Peace, and reading chapters 5 and 6, page 49 through 63. Having thanked Anna Pavlovna for her charmant soiree, the guests began to take their leave. Pierre was awkward. Above average height, broad and stout, with huge red hands, he did not know how to enter a drawing room, as they say, and still less how to leave one. That is, how to say something particularly agreeable before going. Moreover, he was absent-minded. Now, when he got up to go, he picked up the general's three-cornered hat instead of his own, and stood there plucking at the plume till the general asked him to return it. But all his absent-mindedness and clumsiness in entering a drawing room and making conversation was redeemed by his kind-hearted, simple, modest expression. Anna Pavlovna turned to him, and with a Christian meekness that showed her forgiveness of his indiscretion, nodded and said, I hope to see you again, and I also hope you will change your opinions, my dear Monsieur Pierre. He bowed without replying, and again they saw a smile that seemed to say, opinions or no opinions, you see what a fine, good-hearted fellow I am. And everyone, including Anna Pavlovna, instinctively felt that this was true. Prince Andrei went out into the hall, and turning his shoulders to the footman holding his cloak, listened indifferently to the chatter of his wife and Prince Ippolit, who had followed them. Prince Ippolit stood close to the pretty little pregnant princess, staring fixedly at her through his lorgnette. Go in, Annette, or you will catch cold, said the little princess, taking leave of Anna Pavlovna. It's all settled, she added in a low voice. Anna Pavlovna had already managed to discuss the match she hoped to arrange between Anatole and the little princess's sister-in-law. I rely on you, my dear, said Anna Pavlovna, also in an undertone. Write to her and let me know how her father regards the matter. Au revoir, and she left the hall. Prince Ippolit went up to the little princess and, bending down close to her face, commenced whispering something. Two footmen, the princess's and his own, stood waiting for them to finish talking, one holding a shawl, the other a redingote, and both listening to the incomprehensible French with an air of understanding what was being said but not wanting to show it. The princess, as always, smiled as she talked and listened laughingly. I'm very glad I didn't go to the ambassador's, said Prince Ippolit. Such a bore. It's been a delightful evening. Don't you think it's been delightful? They say the ball will be very fine, replied the princess, her downy little lip drawn up. All the most beautiful women in society will be there. Not at all, you won't be there. Not all, said Prince Ippolit, laughing gleefully as he snatched the shawl from the footman, whom he pushed aside so he could wrap it around her himself. Either from awkwardness or intentionally, no one could have said which, he left his arms around her after the shawl had been put on, as if holding her in his embrace. Still smiling, she gracefully moved away, then turned and glanced at her husband. Prince Andrei's eyes were closed, so weary and drowsy did he seem. Are you ready? He asked his wife, looking past her. Prince Ippolit hurriedly put on his redingote, which in the latest fashion reached to his heels, and tripping over it ran out to the porch after a little princess whom a footman was helping into the carriage. Princess, au revoir, he cried, his tongue as entangled as his feet. The princess picked up her skirts and was about to enter the dark carriage. Her husband was adjusting his saber, and Prince Ippolit, on the pretext of helping, got in everyone's way. Allow me, sir, said Prince Andrei austerely, and in Russian addressing Prince Ippolit, who was blocking his way. I shall expect you, Pierre. The same voice sounded cordial and affectionate. The physician gave the signal, and the carriage set off with a rattle of wheels. Prince Ippolit stood on the steps, laughing spasmodically, as he waited for the Viscount, whom he had promised to take home. Eh bien, mon cher, your little princess is very nice, said the Viscount, after seating himself beside Ippolit in the carriage. Very nice indeed. Kissed the tips of his fingers. And quite French. Ippolit snickered and burst out laughing. And you know, you're a terrible fellow with that innocent way of yours, continued the Viscount. I pity the poor husband, that little officer who gives himself the airs of a reigning prince. Ippolit snickered once more, and through his laughter retorted, and you said our Russian ladies couldn't compare with your French ladies. One must know how to tackle them. Pierre arrived before the others, and being quite at home, went straight to Prince Andrei's study, lay down on the sofa as was his habit, took from the shelf the first book that came to hand. It was Caesar's Commentaries, and propping his head on his elbow, commenced reading it from the middle. What have you done to Mademoiselle Scherer? Now she will really be ill, said Prince Andrei, rubbing his small white hands as he came into the study. Pierre rolled over on the sofa, making it creak, and lifting his eager face to Prince Andrei, dismissed the question with a smile and a wave of the hand. You know, that abbey is very interesting, but he doesn't see the thing in the right light. In my opinion, a permanent peace is possible.
A decade before that broadcast, in January 1960, Harold Winkler, Pacifica Radio's president and also KPFA general manager, received an unusual phone call from New York. A former political science professor at the University of California, Winkler had resigned in protest over a required loyalty oath for faculty members. Luckily, he was independently wealthy. On the other end of the line was Louis Schweitzer, a Russian-born millionaire, radio station owner, and also a president, in his case, president of the